Hello and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines and I am the Continuing Education Consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries, located in cold and cloudy Boise, Idaho. Our webinars and other continuing education opportunities are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Everyone is muted and we encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and discuss with other attendees. As you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation, and as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Today's topic is how libraries can better support homeschooling families, presented by Linda Hincks. Linda has 20 years of experience homeschooling and over the years has helped many families in their educational journey. She is here today to help us better understand the homeschooling demographic and how Idaho libraries can better meet their needs. Linda, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. Hi, I am coming to you from Middle Haddam, Connecticut, which is a tiny little hamlet right in the very middle of Connecticut. And I'm going to take a minute here to share my screen with you. There we go. And again, I want to say, please feel free to use that chat feature. I really enjoy reading your comments afterwards. And when you have questions, I will be happy to answer those. Both Jennifer and Annie are willing to help me get and see all of those things. So thank you again for joining me today. So why is my screen not? There it is. So this is me and my kids at the beginning of the pandemic. They are now 19 and 21, and they have never been to school. I trained to be a teacher. I've done a ton of public education in a variety of spaces, and I do have classroom experience. But once my kids once Kat, who is 21, was born, when she was about a year old, I found out about homeschooling and I never went back. So through this, you're going to see a lot of photos of me and my family as we talk through some of this process, and I'll just get going. Here are some of the things that we were going to talk about today, but also I wanted to spend some time talking about homeschoolers as an audience, who they are, so that we can serve them as a group better. And honestly, that is in knowing them as individuals. So I also wanted to say that I work in a library. I love libraries and librarians. When I talk to homeschoolers themselves, one of the big messages I have is that librarians are terrific resources. And as you'll see, there are some quotes coming up through that I think express the conjunction of homeschooling and librarianship. So I often talk about homeschoolers as being in the wild, right? We all have ideas about who homeschoolers are, but until you meet some individuals, you might not realize how different and varied they can be. When I talk to people, they often have a ton of questions, right? What stereotypes do you yourself have about homeschoolers? I'm going to talk about these four before we move through to talk more about how we can see and view them through the lens of a library. Right. So one of the big questions I get is, how many homeschoolers are there? And if you logged on a couple of minutes earlier, we were talking about how COVID has changed the number of homeschoolers that there are. So here is what we had nationwide. You can see this is the percent of school-aged kids in the United States. Now, it's really hard to get numbers for Idaho, similarly as it is to get numbers for homeschoolers from Connecticut, where I live, because we don't have to actually register in a way. So it's hard to get how many people there are, right? But nationwide, this was our guesstimate, right? So then here is what we anticipated homeschooling looking like in 2020 based on a regular rate of growth. However, as you all know, COVID happened, and this is what we experienced instead. So we were over 11% of school-aged kids are homeschooling, which brings us to between 5 and 6 million kids nationally. I'm going to say that again because I just think it's an amazing number, right? If you take the population of Idaho and add it to the population of Connecticut, you get about the number of homeschoolers that we have in the whole nation. Now, that ends up being a lot of kids, and these families, they're not the same, right? Each one is coming for different reasons and different experiences. So another question I get often is, how old are homeschoolers? I think that we have this idea that homeschoolers are young children. They seem to be easier to school at home. It seems less challenging. And so I think a lot of people make an assumption that most homeschoolers are little. And as you can see from this graph, really, it doesn't play out that way. Homeschoolers are of all ages and abilities. And as you can see from this, this information was collected in 2018. Actually, the biggest chunk of kids who were homeschooling were high school aged. And those kids, they tend to be invisible in a lot of ways in the community because they're not necessarily hanging out in groups the way that you see with younger kids all congregating together. A lot of times these older kids are doing internships. They might have a job. They, are doing more solitary things, and they are socializing. I don't want to say that they're not, but you don't necessarily see them on a great big giant field trip together. Also, high school aged kids, they typically sleep a little bit later, right? Just the way that you might have wanted to when you were a teenager. And so a lot of the homeschooled kids that I know who are teens, they don't actually start doing things until the afternoon. And so you're not seeing them out in the wild during the day, right? So why do people come to homeschooling? Well, there's a lot of different reasons here, and you can categorize them into two sections. And one of them is why you might not want to go to school, where school is actually something that you don't want, right? Like you are wanting not what is there. And then the other one is to create something new. It has nothing to do with what school offers at all. So you can see here at the top of this list is concerns about the school environment, and this is safety, bullying, violence. These things that I'm going to be talking about here, these are reasons that people have been saying that they were wanting to homeschool over a course of 10 years or so. And this number actually has been going, this is the one that has been changing most, right? So you can see here, this one has been changing the most, I'm sorry. And then about 50% of families who list concerns who list the reasons for homeschooling talk about this, about half of them. And this is on the rise. More and more families are talking about this, right? But dissatisfaction with instruction. They feel like they could get it better somewhere else. Families who are wanting private school, but don't have the finances to be able to support that. Some of them are homeschooling. Some people want more family time, or they want flexibility to do the things that they want. For example, traveling, right? But there's also reasons to homeschool that have nothing to do with what's at school. And you'll see at the bottom of this list, a lot of people stereotypically think that homeschoolers are choosing homeschooling for religious reasons. But actually, in the last 10 years, this number has decreased by 15%. Only about 21% of families are listing religious reasons as one of the things that they're choosing homeschooling around, right? Now, when I talk about my family, right, now some of these reasons were things that I chose. And so here you'll see I have bolded the things that were important to me, for example, to my family and why we chose homeschooling. But I found that on this list, there actually was something that didn't get listed, and that's that it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's engaging and interesting. It's adventurous. And we spent a lot of time just really enjoying the process. And this is a big one. This one, for those of you who have gone to school, which I'm going to guess is many of us, right? We often compare homeschooling with the schooling that we know and remember, right? So I was in school 6.5 hours a day for 13 years, and then I went to college. And we tend to think that learning takes that much time. However, when you really look at the time spent learning, it's very little, right? And the littler you are, the less time it takes. And that makes sense. If you think about, a kindergarten class, they, not only are they passing out pencils and crayons and those things and the papers, but you have to take time to go to the bathroom and you have time to enjoy recess. The amount of work that you do, the amount of learning that you do is actually quite small. It does increase as you age because we all get better at sitting still and taking in information. But even then, the 9 to 12th graders, right, those high school aged kids, they're spending about 4.5 hours, up to 4.5 hours a day. And this includes the amount of homework that they are doing. So if a kid has, 3 hours of homework, that 4.5 hours, only represents about half of the time spent that a kid in school would spend. So with this, you can see that there's just so much more in the day, and what you do and how you fill outside of those academics really can define what your homeschooling is like. So there's times where you can have hands-on experiences, you can have adventures, you can really go forth into the world and experience things. And I really want to underscore that, because probably the things that you yourself remember that were formative, that really helped you to be the adult that you are now, a lot of them probably didn't happen when you were doing academics. And really, all of us homeschoolers approach our homeschooling just a little bit differently, because what we bring to it is a little bit different. We're all sort of forging our own paths into the world. And sometimes that's scary, and sometimes it's not. Because homeschooling is like a recipe book, right? And sometimes with recipes, you take on the things, you do it exactly as the recipe says, and other times you don't. You change things around a little as you go, and that's okay. Helping homeschoolers to know where they are and what they want can be a really interesting aspect of interacting with homeschoolers in the library. And I want to underscore that libraries, I think, are what made my homeschooling experience with my family successful. Libraries hold so many things, not just books, not just the media that is available there, but it had so many pieces that we could then use to go out into the world to have those experiences. And most importantly, what our library had was librarians, because we all spend so much time with information and curation that I always had confidence that I could go to my library, talk with my librarians, and learn so much more than what I was limited in my own experience around. So I want to say that honestly, things that make homeschooling positive and successful really has to do with these 5 things, right? The attitude of the homeschoolers, the experiences they bring, how much ingenuity they have, how many opportunities there are in their lives, and again, also, when a program is user-friendly, then people use it. And what I would like to do is spend some time thinking about how you yourself can influence and help people with these things. Right? I do want to underscore that homeschoolers homeschool for different reasons. And some of it is reproducing home at school, school at home. But oftentimes we are choosing to homeschool because we want things to be different than they are in a school building. And as such, when we get stressed, when we are uncertain, we then fall back on the things that we ourselves did. And when that thing that we did is school, we end up reproducing school. And sometimes that can be very unsatisfying because we know that that's not what we want. But as humans, we tend to reproduce what we did at school. And sometimes that's great. Here's a picture of my kids doing dissections. We did them outside, we did them with our friends, we laughed a lot, we learned a lot, and reproducing the good parts of my own experience around it really was helpful as a sounding board, as a platform from which I could expand out from. But just as often, we get trapped in the idea of what learning has to look like, and it can produce a lot of battles in the way that you interact with your homeschoolers as the facilitator or teacher. And while the one is really great, the other one can be really unsatisfying for all parties involved. So with this next part, I'd like to give you a peep over the wall into what it's like to be a homeschooler, with the idea that having this understanding can help you make connections with homeschool families to find out what they themselves need and want. So once upon a time, my family decided to homeschool, and these are the ages that they were when I made that decision. They were quite small, and it was not terribly intimidating, or at least not as intimidating as it would become. That's Kat. She is about 3.5 in that picture, and there's Tally. She is not yet 2. But I do want to stress that homeschooling itself is like living with a wild thing. It doesn't stay in the box. It rarely goes as planned. And it's a little bit like skiing downhill very fast. It works out in the end, but keeping your balance can sometimes be difficult. So there is this internal idea of the way that things should be. You make the decision to homeschool, and you yourself have this idea, this great big should about how things are going to happen and unfold. But none of us lives in a vacuum, right? So suddenly, everyone else has a lot of ideas about what you should do. And oftentimes people are not shy about how that comes across. And then when you live in a world with a lot of voices, as a parent, you listen to a lot of them, and it clouds and confuses what ideas you yourself already had. And different people listen to them in different ways. Right? I think that it's important here to understand that each of these shoulds comes from a personal standpoint of how you have lived your life. And these shoulds really translate to a whole bunch of different ideas. Lots of times people tell others that they should or should not do things because something went wrong or because something went right. They do it out of concern and love and caution and experience. I have had strangers tell me what they think I should do just as often as I have had my loved ones tell me what it is that I should do. Well, it's a lot to manage. It's a lot to juggle when what you want is the best for your family, right? And most homeschooling parents, they don't necessarily have a degree in teaching. They don't necessarily have experience with those things. And so there is a lot of insecurity involved in jumping in this leap of faith. So I'd like to explain to you a little bit through this lens of shoulds, right? When you send your kid to school, you can see them there on the left-hand side of the screen, you are allowing other people to make decisions about what your kid should and shouldn't learn, in what order and how that works, right? You have a team of people who are making all of those choices. Now, the further you come along this spectrum to the right, the more decisions the parents and families are making. With online and distance learning, you get to choose between the schools, but then the schools themselves make the decisions about how that works. And often with those types of things, there is a teacher, right? They have a teacher who makes the assignments, and then the parent is then on site helping the kids as they go. With all-in-one curricula, there are quite a lot of them available. And in this, the parent actually is making even more decisions. And then they themselves are facilitating what's in the all-in-one curricula. So they become the teacher. They are the ones who are responsible for making the assignments, for collecting the work. But again, it's like having a recipe book and you have something to follow. Next on this spectrum, we have unit studies, and this one is a really popular way to learn because you can learn, about airplanes, and you can then do math and science of airplanes. You can do the history of airplanes. You can do social justice with airplanes, but all of it is around that one topic, and you can spend a day on a unit study, or you could spend an entire year on a unit study. And in this, oftentimes you're pulling together different resources. So you can see how there's more research involved in that unit studies approach. And then all the way on the other side is a concept that's called unschooling. And this is really the antithesis of school. This is where you're living your life in a way that doesn't resemble anything to do with school. It can be quite mercurial. It goes wild sometimes. This is a philosophy that humans learn regardless of what it is that they are doing. So if you're watching Encanto again for the 5th time, what are they learning from that? If your kid spends a lot of time playing Minecraft, what is it that they are learning from that? With unschooling, the idea is that maybe they're interested in Minecraft because they're interested in architecture. Maybe they're interested in city planning. Maybe they're interested in, my kids want to be writers, right? Like that's a major goal for them. And they have used Minecraft as a space in which to create the worlds that they are writing about so that they can have a representation of seeing how their characters can move through that world. They use Minecraft for so many varied things, and allowing them the space to learn from whatever it is that they're doing helps them to have the building blocks to create their own future. So we have this on the same things on a slightly different spectrum. What I'd like to say is that school and curriculums, they're systemized and complete. You could simply do the things that you have and allow that to have all of the building blocks. You don't have to think or worry about them quite as much, or I should say, in that way, right? But the more you move along the spectrum towards unschooling, the more free form it is, the more your days look very different from each other. And it could be almost anything. I like to call this a trust exercise in how it comes together, right? So with school, you get this safety net, right? You can be fairly confident that your kid is going to get all of the pieces that they need because someone else has spent the time to think about those things. On the other side of the spectrum, it's all you all the time. And there can be quite a lot of anxiety around this feeling, right? A lot of homeschoolers have this existential sense that they're not doing enough because they have to provide all of the bricks for the future. But I would like to say, I know my personal experience with school is that, I found so many holes in my own education that we can only learn so much so fast. And there are so many things to know that I found that I used those holes in my own education as bricks for my children. Whatever I didn't know, whatever I was dissatisfied about not knowing, those were things that I very definitely put into my own homeschooling experience. And I want to say that decision fatigue, doing all of that research, all of those things, it is real. There are so many pieces and they're moving all the time and it's hard to keep track of them. And then on top of that, you have your kids who have their own thoughts and feelings about everything, and managing all of those pieces is exhausting as a parent. And trusting in the process itself can be quite exhausting. I said earlier that it was like leaping right into the void. You don't know what is going to be happening from day to day sometimes. And other times it feels like moment to moment. And so you have to hold on to this idea that this really is the best choice, that there really is something at the end of this that is so beautiful, because there are moments when it is not. But when it works, when it really, truly works, it is like flying. I cannot express how wonderful it is to watch your kids learn and explore and, take on so much. I was very lucky that we had a really great homeschooling community, some of them centered in and around our libraries, where we went places together. We did so much, and the kids learn from other adults and other kids. We were really lucky to have really wonderful relationships with our libraries and librarians. So, in this next section, I'd like to talk about what learning is like, how it works, and get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of how things can be. I'd like to say that if you're looking for specifics, those are things that we're going to talk about in the question and answer part. So please feel free to bring those things. I am going to be talking about this in broad strokes for the next couple of minutes. So I don't know if you have already thought or identified your personal learning style, but I encourage you to look on the screen and figure out which ones of these really appeals to you. Because as humans, we take information in a variety of ways. And there isn't a right way or a wrong way. There's just different ways. But just like before, when I made the point to say that we teach the way that we learned, right? So if you went to public school, it's quite likely that when you view learning for kids, it's through that lens, right? And it seems easy to understand that can be reproduced, right? So there's this idea that every kindergartner is going to make a macaroni picture, right? There's just some ideas that we have that we're not even sure that we have or why we necessarily have them. We teach often the way that we ourselves were taught. But with this slide, with this information, I'd like to make the point that we also teach the way that we ourselves learn. So if you are a verbal learner, it's quite likely that you talk a lot when you are teaching. So as you might expect, I myself am a verbal learner, right? But we don't all learn in one particular way. We learn in a variety of ways. And like muscles, those other ways can be helped to be stronger, right? And so too is that for the ways that we ourselves teach. So I'd like for you to identify where you are on this patch and think about how that influences what you are teaching, how you are taking information in, and how you are letting it go, right? Because this is probably the way that you yourself teach. If when you were at school, you enjoyed, I don't know, book reports, you might assume that everyone enjoys book reports, but that's not necessarily true. When you have an idea about what someone else's learning experience is like, there can be some disconnect between those things. And if what you are offering is not what they want, then they won't come to you for that information, right? So expanding out into these other ways can really help you to make connections with people who learn in a different way than you do. I'd like for you to think about it, right? What was the last thing you learned and how did you go about doing it? Now, and I'm not talking about, not very many of us write a 10-page paper on a subject to prove that we have learned something now, right? Of course, if you're doing grant proposals, that might be part of how it is that you prove that. But in general terms, we ourselves, I learned how to bake bread, for example, right? And I didn't write a paper about it. So what was the last thing you learned and how did you go about it? You might have gotten a mentor. That's a great way to learn. You might have watched a video or gone and had an experience. Like maybe you just tried it out 18 times before it happened to work, right? You might have read an article, or if you were me, 10 or 15 of them, you might have found a book, taken a class, and you might just practice over and over again. Now, here is a thing my mom used to say, good, better, best, never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best. My mom loved the idea of practice, and that made me loathe it, right? Like I did not like practicing my scales on the piano. How tedious and awful. But if you take practice away and replace it with play, often you get the same thing when you are moving in that direction. When practice is playful, it's so much more fun to do. Now, I hope that you have pictured something, thought of something that you yourself have learned. And here I'd like to show you, this is me about almost 10 years ago, teaching at my local library to a group of homeschoolers. We were doing Shakespeare and we utilized the courtyard this is not my personal library, this is a much larger library that was in the middle between these families. But they got a mentor. In this case, it was me, right? We watched videos, we tried it out. I read the articles, they didn't, but we read the Shakespeare play, and then we worked together as a group. to make a play. And it was, in fact, playful, right? There's a lot of experiences to be had, not just by you, but by them. Because so much information is at the library, right? So what makes a successful homeschool experience from, the parents' point of view, but I think also from your point of view, right? There are so many things to be had and found there. We homeschoolers are made up of just ourselves and our own experiences. And sometimes getting out of those experiences means getting different points of view, right? How often do we just find that limitation, right? I myself am just a middle-aged woman, and I have this experience living in suburbia and living in someplace rural. And so finding experiences in books and videos of what it's like to live in a city is different than I would be able to express, right? Connecting any kind of information that we have to some other piece of information, just making those interesting tidbits connect makes a lot of difference. There's so many pieces that can be satisfied by working in the library. So here's that same spectrum again, right? And again, I want to make this point that school can be quite comprehensive, right? It's been put together. And as parents, homeschoolers can really rely upon those things on the left-hand side of this spectrum. But the more you move to the right, the more work the families themselves have to do around finding experiences, information, outlets, right? This on the right-hand side of the spectrum, this is where a lot of homeschooling families could use more support, because the families that are on the left-hand side of this spectrum, they're already relying on people who have made curriculums, right? They already know what they're doing. They don't need more academic type support. What they need is the excess, the extra stuff that we were talking about. They don't need you to figure out which parts of it to do. Now, on the other side, on this right-hand side, these are families that do need help with support for finding what is near what it is that they're already doing. So, if your kid was super interested in Poe, let's say, right? And then they came to you, you could then say, well, here are some other authors who are like this. Here are some other, maybe you're interested in ravens. Maybe there's a lot of avenues to go forward with. And as librarians, that's what we do, right? We are noticing what is near what it is that is on the table so that we can gather those things together. I hope that makes sense to you. Because what makes a successful homeschool experience really is that research, right? The creativity of finding new things and also curating information, because there is a wide world of things out there. Narrowing it down and giving it to people in bite-sized pieces takes a lot of, experience, right? And a lot of times those families, they don't necessarily have it. Like taking the fire hose of information and making it into a drip that's really easy to manage can take a lot of effort and a lot of practice. So, does it sound like anyone you know who does those things? The answer, of course, is you. Now, really, the library has so many things available to people, but it's you who brings it all together. I know that in my life, I always appreciate when people come to me and talk. I want them to do those things so that I can understand better what their individual needs are and then help them with those things. All right. I have one last thought before we move on to a question and answer section, and that is, who is your perfect patron? What qualities do they have? What interactions do you yearn for with them, right? And I ask this at the end here because I think that we homeschoolers are your perfect patron. We're always there. We want the information. We want to go out into the world, and we want to utilize all the things that the library has for a variety of reasons. All right. I think that I am going to stop talking so that we can talk together about some of those things. I will share my screen again at the very end, but I'm going to stop my screen share for now so that I can see all of you. I also wanted to encourage you to put your screens on if you are comfortable with that, because I do like to see the faces of the people that I am talking to. It's just nice. Oh, there's not very many things in the chat. People were just listening.
Yeah, so folks, as you've been listening to this enthralling talk from Linda, if you have any questions, please put those into the chat and then we can get to those.
And while people are typing, I will, that's all right. I will answer a question that I often get, which is making connections with homeschoolers and how I think that that can work. One of those things is to notice what it is that homeschoolers do and don't have. One of the things that I have enjoyed with families who had never been to school is, you know, when you send your kid to school, they have library science classes, right, that tell them how the library works and what's available there, getting them a library card, that kind of thing. And when kids don't go to school, that is a hole in what their experiences are. And so I have had some success in having a library tour with a librarian. So that brings the families in, and then I get to, one, meet them and interact with them, but then I also get to tell them what we have available for them. Just telling them those things, you know, just having them in the space, you can find out what it is that they want, and you can also fix those ideas that they have that are incorrect, which, let me say, there are quite a lot of those, right? Yeah, I'm seeing some smiles.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat for you. In my prior library, I had homeschoolers come in, but parents don't seem to be interested in programs. How do you approach them? I felt like they just wanted to be left alone.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have had some success with is actually having a piece of paper that they can take away and fill out. A Google form also works really well, you know, just to say, hey, we're interested in serving you at your own time, at your leisure, fill this out. And you can put on there, you know, like, do they want passive programming? Do they, you know, are they looking for resources? Are they looking to make connections with other homeschooling families, which may or may not be what they want, right? But, you know, like, I find sometimes families are harried, right? They come in, they have however many kids they have. I mean, I just had two kids, two hands, right? That was what was my experience. But there were days where I just wanted to slip in, get what I wanted, and I wanted to go home. Our relationships with our librarians were built over time. And, I know that that can be a hard answer, but that is how a lot of times it does work out.
Another question, what programs has your library created to help homeschoolers, and how do you decide that those programs will benefit homeschoolers?
Great. So me personally, we participated in, let me back up, right? So a lot of the programs that we wanted to do were not necessarily aimed at homeschoolers, because what we wanted was honestly a bunch of the things that you do for retirees, right? So we did Japanese watercolor painting, and we were the only kids there. We were surrounded by people who were in their 60s and 70s and 80s, right? And we had a great time with that. We weren't necessarily partaking of homeschooling. Our library also had a once a month talk with someone who had traveled, right? So like it was a travelogue, and a local person was, we watched a talk on Egypt and on Vietnam. And so like that was again something that was targeted at the retirees that we just happened to go to because it was in the middle of the day and it was interesting to us. It doesn't need to be a homeschool program in order for it to attract homeschoolers. But we partook of a lot of passive programming as homeschoolers. So one of my favorites that we did at our library was that the librarians had curated boxes, right? And in the box, it changed, right? So they always had like 4 boxes available. And in the box was a cookbook from a country. And then it had in it like a travel log, like the book so that you could, like plan your trip to Ireland and you could see what was there. It had maps in it. We had a craft of some kind to do. And one of the things that was really great about that kind of thing was that someone else had again curated all of that stuff. I could just be like, oh, hey, we're interested in Peru. And then, see what was available there. Because a lot of the time, again, having to pull all that stuff together yourself can be really intimidating and also time consuming.
Related question, sort of, what programs can we as youth librarians offer to make homeschooled kids' experiences even better?
Right. So a lot of ideas are popping into my head. This is a great question. So a lot of times what homeschoolers, it waxes and wanes is what I want to say, that there isn't a magic bullets for how things can work, right? When you have a population of homeschoolers that know each other already, they have a tendency to hang out somewhere else, right? Whether that's at someone's house or at the playground or at a local haunt of whatever kind. The part of that is to allow homeschoolers to see your space as a space that those things can happen in. And there's lots of advantages. And I think you probably already know what they are about using your community room, right? So just putting that idea into their heads can sometimes be a way, an avenue into those kinds of things. What you can do to make to make it more of a homeschool experience, like honestly, making it less like school and more open to the idea that learning happens in a variety of ways. Making things especially hands-on is really great for a variety of ages. Some libraries have a library of things, right? Those kinds of things, getting that information into the hands of homeschoolers can often be really great, especially when the things are, like the snap circuits, right? Like that's a really great toy, right? But your kid uses it 10 times and then it takes up space at your house, right? When the library has those kinds of things, then they can get used 10 times and then you don't have to store them at your house. Do you know what I'm saying? So, you know, that kind of thing. There's a great game with lasers. It's really terrific. But again, right, like how many times are you going to use it? Some families are going to use that a lot and others really aren't. So having like a library of things, our library just got snowshoes for the first time, you know, like that's really great. We also just got, the big library just got things so that you can, you know, access the internet. It's like, you know, the box where you take it out into the world, and then I'm not remembering the name of it right now. I'm sorry. But you know, like those kinds of things that just make your life easier and better. Hotspots, thank you.
Another question. This person would love any ideas for what their library can do to be a staple in their community's homeschooling experience.
Yeah, that is about making connections, right? That's about educating those families to what you have so that they know that you want them to use it. You know, I think there's been a lot of talk about being constantly inviting. I'm not so sure anymore that we can just assume that people will assume that the library has whatever it has, right? It's a battle that I know that I am fighting all the time to just invite. Because the truth about the homeschooling community is that it waxes and wanes, right? So the population that is here right now in homeschooling, a lot of them have never homeschooled before because, as we saw from the numbers at the beginning of my talk, we have almost 3 times as many homeschoolers now as we did 2 years ago. And these people, they've been homeschooling in a vacuum. They honestly don't know what you have because they have been relying on school libraries to do all the work before, right? So they just really, they don't know, right? Like, I think that we take for granted that, you know, they know that we have more than books, but honestly, when you talk to those people, they might think that they don't need you because they have books, because they have a Kindle, because they have whatever, right? And that's tragic because there's so much more out there for them. And a lot of that has to do with who you are, right? Like, you are a dynamic, wonderful person. I do not have to have met you to know that because you're a librarian, and why else would you be one, right? There is so much information out there. It's really great that you are like, you are that fire hose that controls the amount of information that somebody can have, right? They just don't know that you do that. And that's part of the challenge, right? And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this talk, is because you understanding what the homeschool community is like, how varied it is, what people need, will help you to see these people as they come through the door as individuals, right? And then once they open up to you and tell you what it is that their individual needs are, then it becomes so much easier, right? But if they assume that you assume that they're doing it wrong, they're not going to come to you. And they make that assumption.
Okay, Vicky asked, many of my homeschooling families are open about their purpose for homeschooling, namely religious, and they ask specifically for safe book recommendations for their preteens to read. What do you recommend the most?
Oh, I mean, honestly, there are so many books out there. So you're asking me this really great question, and I want to have an answer for you. The truth is that those people's limitations, their ideas about what is good or right is vastly different than mine. So I would have trouble making some of those recommendations. I particularly do like Tuck Everlasting, right? That one is a really great book. Let me think about that, and then I'll like circle back to that if that's okay. Yeah.
Let's see. I am one person, usually by myself. I have one homeschool family with 3 kids that currently use the library often. What can I do for them to make their library visits more meaningful and fun? They don't always come in during programming times.
Mm. Um, so do you mind saying what ages those kids are? Because that might change my answer, right? There's a couple of things that I think are super fun to do that you can do, that you turn into a program, but you can also have scavenger hunt type things. One of the things that I've done successful with my own children in going to the library is to make book spine poetry. And if you're not familiar with that, it's when you pull the titles of the books and you use them as the lines in poetry. It can be really fun, right? So the 9-year-olds probably could really get into that kind of thing. And with the 4-year-old, you can still do that type of thing, but then it becomes more interactive, right? Like they pull books and then you read them to them in the order. And it can be like, that's really great if you don't have a lot of other things to do. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments as they're coming in.
It's okay. You mentioned how the library is a great space. Has reserving space been an issue? Would having a specific space for homeschoolers be ideal to be more inviting for them?
I mean, that's going to depend on your population and how many there are. We have several spaces, and so like that's one of the things that we got messages out around and about with our homeschoolers, because again, sometimes too much information. Either we wrote it down and then handed them a thing like, here's all the stuff that we have available for you. But we didn't just give that to homeschoolers. We gave it to our retirees. We gave it, like pretty much, here's all the stuff that we have. Take it with you. Peruse it at your leisure. The other thing that we did is that we picked a thing to tell people about when they came in every month. So January, it was like, hey, did you know we have community rooms? Right. And then in February, it was going to be, hey, did you know that we have museum passes? Right. Like, just to tell them as they came in so that we could be assured that the message was coming out. When we sent the messages home on the pieces of paper, they didn't read them, right? When we told them about it once a month, it just took a long time for us to get the information out there, but it's like a long haul. So I don't know if that answered your question, right? Like, does having a singular space for homeschoolers, here, let me tell you a secret about homeschoolers, right? They like to hang out with other homeschoolers. The idea of hanging out with schooled kids, like from the parent's perspective, right? Like, and this is a parental thing, right? When my kid makes friends with kids who go to school, it means that they are only available X times, right? When my kid makes homeschool friends, then we can hang out during school hours. It's not limited to, after school and weekends, right? So the parents shy away from intermixing with schooled kids, not for any particular reason other than it's less practical than hanging out with other homeschooled families, right? Sometimes it has to do with like values or experiences or the kids making connections. Like my daughter Kat had a really hard time interacting with schooled kids, even though we tried it out, because she learned from adults that, the way that you greet someone is to shake hands, right? No other first grader on the playground wanted to shake hands with my kid, but that's about experience, right? It didn't have anything to do other than that. And kids are humans, right? Like the kids at school know the kids at school and they're comfortable. And so meeting new people is harder because they don't cross paths quite as frequently, right? But there's no reason that they can't. But the secret is that often they don't, right? So when you have programs, after school programs for schooled kids, a lot of times homeschoolers will read that as, that's not for us, for a variety of reasons, right? So if you ran that same after school program 2 hours beforehand, you might get homeschoolers to show up because they'd be like, oh, that program, like, oh, that Lego program, that's really great. I wanted to do that, but I'm not doing it after school. Suddenly that it's at, like 1:30 in the afternoon becomes really engaging. You're like, oh, that's for me, right? Because like I just told you that homeschoolers are very varied, but that one thing is like across the board. Almost all homeschoolers I know are like that.
What are things in programs that you feel would be a turnoff for homeschoolers? Like what would cause them to not come back?
Great question. And my first answer was nothing. And then my second answer was, oh, right, quizzing my kid. Quizzing my kid is a turnoff, right? And that happens to us all the time. Go to the grocery store and somebody's like, oh, you're homeschooled? What's the capital of Hawaii? And I'm like, do you know the capital of Hawaii? Like, if it's Googleable, why are we asking my kid, right? But like I've had people give my kids math quizzes in the grocery store, right? Like just because they feel entitled to. And I'm not saying that you do that, but it is a big turnoff when people quiz your kid about whatever, right? And a lot of times adults do that in place of saying, hey, what are you interested in? Which is a big turn on as a homeschooler, right? Hey, like, weren't you here last time? You know what? We talked about this thing and this new thing came in, right? Like, our librarians used to, when they got new books in, they'd hold them to the side because they knew that we were coming, right? Be like, oh, you really like this thing. Here, I saved this for you. We always took those book recommendations home, right? Like it didn't need to be something that we knew about. It did, like we felt special and it made us come back, right? Again, I'm reading the comments and I shouldn't. So really, those kinds of connections, being seen as individuals, really was a thing that brought us back time and again, right? And now still, my kids, I told you at the beginning, my kids are 19 and 21. When I go to the big library where we were, because I used to live on the other side of town and we were very close to that library, all those librarians, right? I see them out in the wild and they're like, oh, how's Cat and Tally? What are they? Oh, they're 19 and 21. How time flies, right? Like they knew us and we knew them. And they could have done absolutely anything and we would have been there, just like hanging on every word. And that's hard to do when you're in a big place. It's hard to do now. But that's like what brought us back was that we were people. Right? And my kid wasn't confused for some other kid.
So let's see, many libraries work with public schools as well. How do we break down the barrier that is between homeschool versus public school and have services that are geared towards both?
It's a great question. Knowing that there is that stigma, right? And that it's the parents and not the kids, right? That is that problem. I mean, I will say that there was a time when we were the guinea pigs for the real program, right? So they would try out a program on us and we were helping them, and they were helping us. But I think that really, so one of the other barriers to it, and I've kind of already said this, is that people hang out with the people that they know already. And as humans, building those connections outside of that can be really difficult, right? So having a space in your program that is a get to know you spot, right? That doesn't assume that everyone already knows everybody's name, for example, right? Something that helps to like cross those barriers. There is a woman, her name is Jennifer. I'll find it for you and I'll send it to Amy and Jennifer. So she does a really great program about the kids all pick a button when they come in, right? And so they have this tangible thing. And then in the program, it says, you know, and all the buttons are different, right? So there's big ones and little ones, and there's a different colored one. And then in the program, she says, find someone with the same size button as you. And then they go and so they have to talk to each other, right? And then later in the program, she says, okay, you know, find someone who has the same color button as you, and then they find someone different, right? And in doing so, the kids have a reason, right? The humans have a reason to find someone different. And so it becomes less cliquey, you know, but that can be a really great way to intermix them, because otherwise, you know, like it's hard to say to anyone, you know, find someone you don't know. And they're like, oh, but I brought my best friend. And so I'm going to stay with them, you know? And then if you have that one kid who who came by themselves, right? And they really want to interact with somebody different, but they don't know how.
I really like this question. Is there another word to use besides homeschool to connect with these families?
That's a great question, because different people take on different aspects of those things. So some people don't like the home part of school, and people don't like the school part of homeschool. Some people say home educate, you know, and people who are on the extreme side of that spectrum who unschool, they don't want to label at all, right? Like, so that makes it really difficult to do that. But there are pockets of different things. And so I would assume that like over Idaho, there's probably 2 or 3 different terms. So I would, you know, query the people who are in your area, what are they calling themselves? But homeschool, home educate is really popular. Yeah, there's a ton of them. So ask them and then they'll give you that answer.
Okay, I think this is last question. For people thinking on doing homeschooling, where do you recommend finding curricula?
So that really depends on what their background is, and there are so many options, right? And so there's like science for not sciencey people, and you know, like there's you know, lots of different things. I hope, Jennifer, are you keeping track of the things that I said that I would send you? Because I need that. I knew that you would. So there's actually a quiz that you can take, and the quiz tells you what style of homeschooling you would like. And I suggest that you yourselves take this quiz, it's a great quiz, but also take it, and if you encourage other people to take it, with the idea that this is your ideal. This is not what you have had, right? This is not what you think that you want. These questions are, you know, like in a vacuum, how many books would you read, right? Like how important is that part to you, right? And then there's, I think that there's like 9 or 10 outcomes for what your philosophy is, right? And then you can research what those things are within it, right? And then once you know, then you can search for a curriculum, right? But there's so many different options, and there's so many different reasons to choose the different options. I don't have one that I say is the best, because we're all so different. Like it's hard, can't, right? It'd be like saying, I'm going to pick a favorite color for every homeschooler. Not going to do it. All right, let me share my screen one more time so that I can put my my information up so that you will have it, right? Those are my kids at the New York City Library. In fact, reading, I think that they found The Secret Garden there. Oh, I forgot to say, I do programming for patrons about homeschooling, about like how to start and to answer some of those questions. I also do programming for how to make lesson plans yourself and how that stuff works together. And there's this one that has my email address on it. Please feel free to contact me if you would like more information, if you'd like for me to speak at your library, on any of those things. I would be happy to correspond with you. Just know that I'm in Connecticut, so I'm several hours in the future by comparison. All right, I'm going to stop this share again. And there you go.
Thank you, Linda. That wren is lovely, by the way. I love
Thank you. Thank you for noticing. That is my very own wren. And then my 19-year-old digitized it for me. And I am so pleased with it.
It's lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I believe, Annie, do you have information about how everybody will get follow-up information?
Yeah, so just a second, I have a slide to share about that.
Look at us sharing our screen. We're so
much.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, as you close this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation, and we always appreciate your honest feedback. We'll be sending you out a link to the recorded version of this webinar in 1 week, and that'll also have any links that we've curated and resources that Linda will share with us as well. You can follow a link in that email to see previous recorded versions of our Info2Go series, as well as to see what's coming up next. Speaking of what's coming up next, we have the next Info2Go is findhelp.org, connecting patrons to local support services, happening next Wednesday at the same time, same place. So thank you everybody for attending today's Info2Go webinar. I'm going to stop the recording now.